On summer nights, the street always looked calm. The trees bent over the sidewalks, their branches forming a kind of canopy, and the houses, lined up with the same manicured lawns and pale fences, gave the neighborhood a sense of order that was almost too perfect. People who didn't live there would think it was safe, even dull. But those who lived behind those identical white doors knew better. Beneath the fresh paint and trimmed hedges was a constant pull of power, a hidden tension that never really left. It showed up in the smallest things, arguments over where someone parked, notes about trash bins left out too long, whispers about whose grass was browning. The Homeowners Association wasn't just a committee here. It was a ruler. And at the center of it was a woman who had made herself impossible to ignore. Everyone called her Karen, though that wasn't her given name. She wore her authority like a badge, her voice sharper than the edges of the fences she insisted every house needed. She wasn't violent, not in the way people imagine when they hear the word crime, but she knew how to use rules and paperwork to bend people to her will. Her smile carried judgment, her eyes carried suspicion, and her word carried weight with the board. Neighbors learned quickly not to cross her, or at least not if they wanted peace. Across the street from Karen's house was a fence that stood taller than most, a strong wooden barrier stained a deep brown, built to last. It belonged to a man who kept mostly to himself, polite but not overly friendly, the kind of person who waved when he had to, but didn't linger in small talk. His fence wasn't just wood hammered into the ground, it was protection. It separated his world from the constant meddling that seemed to run down that street like an unseen current. For months, the air between those houses was heavy with the usual unspoken rivalry. Ends, a thing unusual for a neighborhood where everyone lived close enough to hear one another's arguments through open windows. But then came the sound that broke that fragile calm. A crash, metal against wood. A sound so violent it snapped everyone's heads toward the street. In an instant, that quiet block was no longer ordinary. Long before the crash, though, signs of trouble had been circling. Karen's son, younger, but already carrying himself with the same kind of entitlement his mother wore, had been the kind of boy who looked at rules as something written for others. He wasn't reckless in a wild, dramatic way, but careless in small ways that piled up. He drove too fast down streets meant for children on bicycles, his music loud enough to rattle glass. Neighbors muttered about him the way people mutter about a storm they can't stop but know is coming. Karen defended him with a fierceness that bordered on blindness. Every time he brushed too close to trouble, she stepped in with that same sharp smile, that same cold insistence that her family was above reproach. She carried herself like the neighborhood sheriff, ready to point out others' flaws while closing her eyes to the ones that lived under her roof. And so her son grew bolder, cushioned by the certainty that his mother would always shield him. Life went on, day after day, with that invisible tension sitting just beneath the surface. On the outside, the street remained a picture of suburban order. Sprinklers clicked on in the mornings, mail carriers pushed envelopes into boxes, and dogs barked at the same time each evening. But in quiet conversations between neighbors, in the glances exchanged when Karen walked by, there was the unspoken truth that everything could shift at any moment. Some of the families felt trapped by her authority, as if they were living under watch. The association meetings turned into stages for her monologues, where she spoke about order, respect, and responsibility, with a tone that left no space for disagreement. People nodded, not because they agreed, but because they feared the weight of her disapproval. Even the way she carried her purse, clutched against her like a shield, seemed to remind others that she could and would protect her own, even at the cost of anyone else. It was in this uneasy balance that the fence stood, a strong line between one man's peace and one family's control. That fence had survived storms, the wear of time, even the quiet resentment of Karen herself, who once complained it didn't match the look of the neighborhood. But it had never faced what was coming, never felt the force of steel and speed fueled by arrogance. When the night of the crash arrived, it wasn't out of nowhere. It was the boiling point of why Years of small battles of pride and denial, of a boy growing up with too much protection and too little consequence. The sound of tires screeching down the narrow street was the final crack in that delicate facade. The neighborhood, so used to gossip and quiet feuds, was about to become the stage for something louder, something that couldn't be hidden behind HOA rules or polite smiles. The crash was only the beginning, but in that moment, as the sound echoed and the quiet block filled with voices, the stage was set. The perfect houses, the manicured lawns, the power games. They all became the backdrop for a story that would show how far denial could go and how quickly control could slip away when reality came crashing through the woods and into the lives of everyone who thought they were safe. The crash didn't settle the street. It split it wide open. After that night, the air seemed thicker, charged with something you could almost feel pressing against your skin. The broken boards from the fence had barely been cleared away when the arguments began. Karen's son stood there, arms folded across his chest, smirking even as neighbors stared at the wrecked car half on the sidewalk, half in the yard. He said it wasn't his fault. He said the fence was too close to the road. He even said the man whose fence had been standing there solid for years should pay for the damage to his car. That single claim lit a fire no one could put out. The police came, their flashlights cutting through the dark as they walked around the crumpled hood and the splintered wood. They asked questions, took statements, and wrote reports. And then, in a moment that felt like justice finally slipping into place, they called for a tow truck. The car that had crashed into the fence, the car that had been his pride and his toy, was dragged away in front of everyone. Neighbors stood on porches, their arms crossed, whispering in satisfaction. But Karen's face told a different story. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting from the officers to the man with the broken fence, her whole body stiff with the kind of rage that waits for the right place to spill. That should have been the end. A crash, a towed car, a lesson learned. But people like Karen don't let endings come that easily. She began her work quietly at first, moving through the neighborhood with pointed comments, suggesting the fence wasn't up to code, hinting that maybe it had been dangerous to begin with. At HOA meetings, her voice slid between concern and accusation, questioning whether certain neighbors really cared about the standards of the community. Each word was aimed like a dart, never direct enough to accuse, but sharp enough to wound. Her son, stripped of his car and humiliated by the whispers that followed him, grew restless. He had been used to moving through the neighborhood with a swagger, his music shaking windows, his tires spitting gravel. Now, without his car, he walked. And in those walks, his anger brewed. He stopped to glare at the fence every time he passed it, his jaw tightening, his fists clenching at his sides. It wasn't just wood anymore. To him, it was a symbol of his humiliation, a reminder that the neighborhood had seen him lose. The man with the fence tried to stay out of it. He replaced the broken boards, worked in silence. Sayan kept his head down. But in a place like this, silence doesn't protect you. It only feeds the stories others tell about you. Karen twisted his quiet into arrogance, telling anyone who would listen that he thought he was better than the rest of them, that he built his fence too tall, too dark, too proud. She painted him as an outsider on his own street, and slowly people began to look at him differently. It wasn't just pride at play. Behind Karen's obsession was something darker, a need for control that seeped into every corner of her life. Her marriage had been hollow for years. Her husband more shadow than partner, leaving her to grip the HOA with both hands, as if running the neighborhood could fill the emptiness inside her house. Her son was all she had left to prove she was more than just another unhappy woman in a too-big house. His mistakes weren't failures to her. They were challenges to be erased, battles to be won. Protecting him wasn't just about love. It was about survival, about proving she still held power where it mattered. Her son's struggle was different. He was drowning in the weight of expectation, in the shadow of a mother who wouldn't let him fail, but also wouldn't let him breathe. Losing his car wasn't just losing a vehicle. He was losing his freedom, his mask, the thing that made him feel untouchable. Now he felt the stares, the quiet laughs, the judgment he wasn't used to. Every night, he paced in his room, music low and angry, replaying the crash in his head and rewriting it so he wasn't the one to blame. His anger grew teeth, and each time his mother whispered in his ear about how unfair it all was, those teeth sank deeper. Meanwhile, whispers about money began to stir. Karen had stretched herself thin, keeping up appearances, pouring cash into maintaining the perfect home, the perfect image. Her son's car had been expensive, a gift she could barely afford, but had given anyway, because appearances mattered more than balance sheets. Now, with the car gone and the cost of repairs looming, the cracks in her finances grew. She turned that pressure outward, looking for someone to blame, someone to hold accountable, so she wouldn't have to face her own crumbling walls. The neighborhood, once only quietly divided, now picked sides. Some saw through Karen's games, tired of her endless demands and rules. Others, too afraid of her influence, nodded along, echoing her words about the fence being a hazard, about the man across the street being reckless for putting it there. At block gatherings, conversations turned sharp, laughter faltered when the wrong names were mentioned, and people left earlier than usual, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. Past grievances rose to the surface too. Neighbors who had been fined for leaving trash bins out overnight now remembered it was Karen who reported them. Families who had paid for unnecessary repairs after HOA warnings started whispering about whether those violations were ever real. Slowly, her grip on the community wavered, and that loss of control only made her fight harder. The man with the fence, caught in the middle, began to feel the shift pressing in on him. He had built his life on the idea that hard work and silence could keep him safe, but now he saw the way Karen's son lingered near his yard, the way Karen's eyes followed him at meetings. The peace he had tried to build behind that fence was slipping away, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't just defending property, he was defending himself. The days grew heavier, filled with Saint, hours that lasted too long, words that cut too sharply, and nights where the sound of footsteps outside a window could no longer be dismissed as harmless. The street wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a battlefield dressed up in white fences and trimmed lawns. And at the center of it, Karen and her son pulled tighter together, feeding each other's anger, shaping their story until it was no longer about a car or a fence. It was about pride, power, and the refusal to lose. Every step forward from there was a step closer to the breaking point. The arguments are louder, the accusations are harsher, the fear deepens. No one could stop what was coming, not even those who saw the storm building on the horizon. And when it finally came, no one would be able to say they hadn't seen the signs. They had been there all along, carved into every look, every word, every board of that fence that had become the line between order and chaos. The night it all came crashing down didn't feel different at first. The street was still, the kind of quiet where even the hum of the street lamps seemed louder than usual. Houses sat in their usual order, blinds drawn, porches dark, sprinklers ticking off one by one. But there was something tense in the air, the kind of heaviness that sits in the chest and makes the world feel on edge. For days, Karen and her son had been circling that house with the fence, their stares sharp enough to cut through the dark. And now, under a swollen moon, it all boiled over. Her son had been drinking. The sharp smell of alcohol clung to him as he paced back and forth in their living room, his fists opening and closing like he was holding onto something invisible but burning. His mother sat in her chair, lips thin, eyes narrowed, feeding him the same words she had been whispering for weeks. They think they're better than us. They're laughing at you. They're laughing at me. Each sentence landed like fuel on fire. He wanted to prove them wrong, to take back the pride that had been stripped from him the night his car was dragged away in front of the whole neighborhood. By the time he stormed out of the house, Karen didn't stop him. Maybe she thought he needed to release the anger. Maybe she thought he'd scare the man into submission. Maybe, deep down, she wanted him to. She stood at the window as he crossed the street, her shadow stretched long against the curtains, her fingers trembling as they gripped the sill. The man with the fence was outside, as if he had known this was coming. He had been fixing a loose board, hammer in hand, when he heard the footsteps. He turned, eyes narrowing when he saw Karen's son weaving across the lawn. The smell hit him first, sharp, sour alcohol carried by the wind. Then came the words, slurred but venomous, "You're gonna pay for this." The hammer hung loose in his hand, but his stance was firm, his jaw set. He didn't want trouble, but he knew there was no avoiding it now. The space between them felt charged, like a storm about to split the sky. The boy shoved him first, hard enough to rattle him against the fence. The sound of wood groaning under the impact echoed down the street, and lights flicked on behind closed curtains. Neighbors peeked out, drawn to the noise, but none stepped outside. Words flew, shouts, curses, threats. The man tried to stand his ground, telling him to go home, to sober up, but the bite, oi, only grew louder. Spit flew with his words, his fists tightening, his body lunging forward again and again. The man lifted the hammer, not in attack, but in warning, holding it between them like a shield. But the boy didn't stop. His rage was too thick, his pride too wounded. He lunged again, and this time it wasn't just a shove. It was a swing, wild and reckless. The man reacted before thought could catch up, the hammer coming down in a single desperate arc. The sound it made when it connected was sickening, a crack that split the night and froze everything in place. The boy dropped instantly, his body crumpling against the base of the fence, his breath torn from him in a choked gasp. The hammer clattered onto the grass, the man staring down at his shaking hands as if he couldn't believe they belonged to him. The street was silent for a heartbeat, the kind of silence that weighs more than any noise. Then Karen's scream cut through the air, raw and piercing, as she burst from her front door and ran across the street. She dropped to her knees beside her son, her hands clawing at his shirt, her voice breaking as she begged him to open his eyes, to breathe, to move. Her cries carried through the neighborhood, pulling people from their homes, drawing a circle of stunned faces around the scene. The man stood frozen, his chest heaving, his mind spinning with disbelief. He hadn't meant for this. He hadn't wanted this. He only wanted it to stop. Neighbors whispered, their voices trembling, their bodies tense. Some said to call an ambulance, others said it was too late. The flashing red and blue lights arrived soon after, painting the street in chaos. Officers rushed in, their commands sharp, their movements quick, while paramedics bent over the boy's body, working frantically, their hands moving with practiced urgency. Karen screamed at the man, her words jagged with grief and fury. "You killed him! You murdered my son!" Her eyes burned with hate, her voice tearing through the night like glass shattering. The man tried to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy, his mind trapped in the echo of that single crack. The officers separated them, pulling Karen back as she kicked and fought against their grip, pulling the man aside as they demanded answers. His voice was low, shaking, as he tried to tell them it was self-defense, that he hadn't had a choice. But the blood staining the grass, the limp body on the ground, the hammer lying just inches away, none of it looked like defense. It looked like a killing. The immediate aftermath was a storm of noise and light. Radios crackled, cameras flashed as curious neighbors pulled out their phones, and Karen's sobs rose and fell like waves against the chaos. The boy was lifted onto a stretcher, his face pale under the harsh glow of the ambulance lights. Karen tried to follow, screaming that she had to stay with him, that they couldn't take him without her. The doors slammed shut, cutting her off, and the ambulance sped away into the night. The man was handcuffed, his wrists burning against the cold steel, his eyes locked on the ground as they led him to the waiting cruiser. His heart pounded against his ribs, his stomach twisted, and all he could see when he closed his eyes was the moment of impact, the way everything had ended, in a single, brutal second. Karen stood in the street, her body shaking, her face streaked with tears and fury. She wasn't just a grieving mother. She was a woman already rewriting the story in her head, preparing to fight, to make sure he paid for what had happened. Her screams followed him as the car door closed, her words echoing through the night. "You'll pay for this! I'll make sure of it!" The neighborhood that had once been quiet, where every house had looked the same and every lawn had been trimmed to perfection, was no longer the same. The fence still stood, though blood-stained at its base, a reminder that even in the safest-looking places, violence could bloom. And as the police car pulled away, carrying the man who had tried so hard to stay out of trouble, the weight of what had happened settled over every house, every family, every watching eye. It wasn't just a crime. It was the breaking point of everything that had been simmering for years. Pride, power, denial. All of it had finally snapped. And now, no one on that street would ever look at the other the same way again. The days after the crime unfolded like a fog that never lifted. The street, once filled with morning routines and small talk, was now marked by silence. Neighbors avoided eye contact when they passed one another. Children were hurried inside earlier than usual. Lawns stayed uncut, mail piled in boxes, and the scent of unease hung heavier than the trimmed hedges ever had. The world had shifted, and everyone on that block carried the weight of what they had seen, or what they couldn't stop from happening. The man who had swung the hammer sat in a holding cell, his hand still shaking days later, as though the echo of that moment hadn't yet left his body. He replayed it endlessly. The shove, the slurred threats, the desperate raise of his arm. But no matter how he tried to frame it in his mind, it always ended the same way, with the sickening crack and the boy collapsing at his feet. He told himself it had been self-defense, that he hadn't wanted to hurt anyone, but guilt doesn't bend to reason. It seeped into his bones, a quiet poison that made it hard to breathe. Karen, on the other hand, refused to bend at all. Her grief turned sharp, hardened into something she carried like a weapon. At first, she cried endlessly, her sobs rattling through her empty house, the sound carrying through thin walls into the street. But soon her tears gave way to fury. At the funeral, dressed in black, she didn't just mourn her son. She turned her pain into a rallying cry. She told anyone who would listen that her boy had been murdered, that the man with the fence had been waiting for a reason to attack. She spoke with a conviction that made it difficult for people to argue, even when they had seen how it started. Her son's friends came in clusters, whispering stories about how he had been misunderstood, how he wasn't a bad kid, how he had been pushed too far. But behind those stories, there were quieter truths. Some admitted in hushed tones that he had been drinking too much, that he was reckless, that he carried himself like the rules didn't apply. Yet none of them said it loud. It felt wrong to speak ill of someone who wasn't there to defend himself, and easier to let the grief rewrite him into something cleaner, something softer. The neighborhood itself fractured. Some sided with Karen, either out of pity, fear, or genuine belief that a line had been crossed. Others stood by the man who had been arrested, convinced he had only done what anyone would in his place. But even those who supported him did so quietly, afraid of being singled out. Every porch light, every window curtain, became a symbol of where people stood. Trust dissolved into suspicion, and the block turned into something colder than it had ever been under Karen's rule. The media caught wind of it quickly. Local news stations arrived with cameras, their lights glaring against the white fences as they interviewed anyone willing to talk. Headlines painted the story in bold contrasts, grieving mother versus violent neighbor. Few mentioned the son's drinking or the way he had provoked the fight. Complexity didn't make for good TV. The man was cast as the aggressor, his mugshot plastered across screens, while Karen's tears became the image of tragedy. For viewers who had never walked down that street, the story was simple. But for those who had lived under Karen's watchful eye, the truth was tangled in ways outsiders would never fully know. The man's family, distant but still tied to him, felt the shame ripple outward. Siblings who hadn't spoken to him in years now found themselves fielding questions from co-workers, friends, even strangers. His name was whispered in grocery aisles, his face studied with curiosity and judgment. He had once been known simply as a quiet man who kept to himself. Now he was known for blood on a fence. For Karen, the aftermath became her stage. She leaned deeper into her role, not just as a grieving mother, but as the voice of justice. She attended every hearing, her presence loud even when she didn't speak. She demanded accountability, speaking to reporters outside the courthouse, painting herself and her son as victims of cruelty and violence. But beneath that fury, in the quiet of her empty house, she couldn't escape the truth. Her son's room still smelled of the cologne he wore, his belongings scattered as if he would return any moment. She lay awake at night, hearing his laughter in the walls, feeling the hollow space where his voice should have been. Rage was easier than sorrow. It kept her moving. But grief was there, waiting, and when it caught her, it left her gasping. The neighbors, too, carried scars. Children who had peeked through blinds that night now had nightmares of blood on grass and screaming in the dark. Parents who had rushed them away from windows struggled to explain why adults, who were supposed to know better, had let things spiral so far. The fence itself became a grim reminder, its wood repaired again, but forever marked in people's minds as the place where everything fell apart. As weeks turned into months, the court process dragged on, each hearing pulling the wound open again. Lawyers argued over intent, over self-defense, over the character of both men. Witnesses were called, neighbors forced to relive the night in statements, their voices shaking as they tried to recall every detail. The man sat in the courtroom, thinner now, his face lined with exhaustion, while Karen glared at him from across the aisle, her grief wrapped tightly around her anger. Public opinion shifted like sand. At first, the man was painted as a killer, but as more details surfaced, cracks formed in that story. Some began to see him as a man cornered, a man pushed past, his breaking point. Yet the damage had already been done. His reputation was gone, his life uprooted. Even if he walked free, he knew he could never return to that street, never rebuild behind that fence again. Karen's grip on the HOA loosened, not because she lost her voice, but because the community grew weary. Her pain had consumed everything, every meeting, every interaction. Some neighbors moved away, unable to stand the weight of it. Others pulled back, avoiding her calls, her demands. The power she once held over the street slipped quietly from her hands, leaving her with only the echo of what she had lost. The aftermath wasn't just about the crime. It was about the way it exposed everything that had been simmering for years. The pride, the resentment, the denial, the cracks hidden under perfect lawns. A fence had been broken, but so had illusions. And as time wore on, the community settled into a new reality, one where safety felt fragile, trust felt impossible, and every glance at that stretch of wood carried the memory of a night when everything changed. The story wasn't just about who was guilty or who was innocent. It was about what happens when power, pride, and silence collide. About the weight of grief, the poison of denial, and the cost of a single desperate moment. And in the quiet that followed, long after the lights of the cameras faded and the trial wound down, those who had lived through it carried a truth they couldn't unsee. That even in the neatest of neighborhoods, darkness waits just beneath the surface, and sometimes all it takes is one crack to let it through. The trial ended months after it began, but for those who lived on that street, it never really ended at all. In the courthouse, the air had been heavy with tension each day, the man sitting on one side, Karen on the other, her eyes sharp with the kind of hatred that can't be softened by time. Witnesses spoke, evidence was laid out, and lawyers twisted every word to fit their side. The jury had the impossible task of deciding whether a desperate swing of a hammer was murder or survival. In the end, the verdict came down to something in between. The man wasn't convicted of murder, but neither did he walk away clean. Manslaughter, they called it, an act born from fear and impulse rather than premeditation. The sentence was years, not life, but it was enough to strip him of everything he had built. His home would be sold, his fence torn down, his life reduced to several days he would count out behind bars. For him, justice was a twisted thing. He hadn't wanted to kill. He had only wanted to be left alone. But now he carried the weight of a life he couldn't give back, a burden that would never ease, no matter how much time he served. Karen left the courthouse with her head held high, convinced that her fight had been won. She had demanded accountability, and in her eyes, the conviction was proof that the world had agreed with her. Yet, when the cameras stopped flashing and the reporters left, she returned to an empty house where her son's room sat untouched, where silence filled every hallway. She had her victory, but victory could not bring him back. Her grief remained, raw and endless, and her rage could only mask it for so long. At night, when the world was quiet, she found herself listening for footsteps that would never come, laughter that had been silenced. Justice, as it was handed down, did not heal her. It only reminded her of what she had lost. The neighborhood tree. Eyed to move on, though it was never the same. The fence was rebuilt again, but its boards carried a story everyone knew. Children walked past it a little faster, adults glanced at it a little longer, as though it still held the memory of blood on the grass. Families who once gathered for block parties now kept to themselves, the spirit of community broken by fear and distrust. Some moved away altogether, unable to live where the shadows of that night lingered. Those who stayed learned to live with the weight of it, the way one learns to live with a scar, always present, always reminding. The media moved on quickly, as it always does. Another crime, another tragedy took its place in headlines, and the world forgot. But the people who had lived it didn't forget. They carried it in the way they watched one another more carefully, in the way they spoke less openly, in the way they avoided letting small arguments grow. It was a quiet lesson written in pain. That pride and silence, when left to rot, can turn deadly. From the outside, the story seemed like a simple one. A reckless young man, an angry confrontation, a desperate act of violence. But beneath it lay something more complicated. It was about power and denial, about how far people will go to protect their image, their pride, their sense of control. Karen had spent years wielding her authority like a weapon, and her son had grown under the shield of her protection, never learning what it meant to face consequences. The man across the street had spent years hiding behind silence, convincing himself that staying out of conflict would keep him safe. In the end, both ways of living collided, and neither came out whole. Justice, if it can even be called that, was messy. The courts handed down their decision, but no one walked away satisfied. A young man was dead, his life cut short not just by one blow, but by the years of unchecked arrogance and protection that had led him there. A neighbor lost his freedom, branded forever by an act he would give anything to undo. A mother lost her son and gained only bitterness in return. And a community lost its innocence, its peace fractured by the knowledge that violence can grow even in the neatest, most orderly streets. On a broader scale, the story was a reminder of something larger than one neighborhood. It was about the fragile balance between control and chaos, about the way pride can blind people to the truth, about the hidden cracks in communities that look perfect from the outside. It spoke to the dangers of entitlement, of the belief that rules are for others, of the way unchecked power can poison not just a person, but everyone around them. And it showed how silence, choosing not to speak, not to act, can be just as dangerous as rage. The moral lines blurred in ways that made it impossible to walk away with clean answers. Was the man with the fence guilty of defending himself too harshly, or guilty of letting his anger spill over in a single, irreversible act? Was Karen a grieving mother, or a woman whose denial and control had helped create the storm that killed her son? The truth lived in the grey, in the uncomfortable space where morality and survival crash into one another. What lingered most wasn't the crime itself, but what it revealed about human nature. That pride can become poison, that grief can become fury, that silence can become complicity, and that even in the safest places, danger lives just beneath the surface, waiting for the wrong night, the wrong word, the wrong push. The street would never be what it once was. See who lived there, every sound of tires screeching, every raised voice, every knock at the door carried the memory of what had happened. They had learned the hardest truth, that justice isn't always clean, that safety is never certain, and that sometimes the darkest battles aren't fought in alleys or cities, but right outside your front door, under the glow of streetlights, between the fences that are supposed to keep you safe. And so, the story closed not with victory, not with peace, but with a reflection etched into everyone it touched. That crime is never just about one act. It is about everything that comes before and everything that follows after. That morality isn't simple, justice isn't perfect, and human nature isn't predictable. And that in the end the cost of pride, denial, and silence is always heavier than anyone expects to bear.